I have made a few changes, just playing around with different options with some of the meta nodes, switching some between the mixed outputs, and also changing that final connection between the detail section and the original uh, building area, and switching that over to the combination mode that will probably pick out some of the better parts of the detail. So setting that to the minimum combination mode in the combiner. And then I've made just a change at the end so that with the map and some of the other changes I made, just making sure that everything is between -1 and 1. So just a few changes to the contrast within that square filter throughout some of the nodes. Some with higher contrast, some with lower contrast for the smaller squares. Using the smaller contrast, I was able to avoid some spiky areas and small overlapping areas. And then the final output scale from the XYZ product math node is a little bit different. So a lot of buildings in this one, there really aren't any big sections mixed in with it, because I think I'm going to use a different terrain for that. But this would just be kind of an overall function to start with. So just to take a look at the current scene in a render before we start the material. So it does look a little busy overall. I think what I'm just going to do is reduce the height of the terrain before we start. Just reduce that down a little. It was just a little too tall. And I did just go to the camera and change the focal to 26 millimeter. But let's take a look at some of the different material options we have available. Each one has its pros and cons. There's also version dependence. If you are using anything prior to version 7, a copy and paste will be required of the terrain function. And since this does have some benefits, no matter what version you're using, we'll take a look at that one first. So what we can do is copy the terrain function, or the altitude production function, right-click, copy it, go over to the procedural terrain. We're going to open that up, and this is set to object parametric by default. If it's not, you can just change it over to object parametric. And I'm going to start by pasting this function into the bump channel within the advanced material editor, and making sure that our scale is set to 1. Now, because this is a material transfer, and the material itself uses the z-axis, we do need to reduce or remove that part of the vector in order to get this to look correct, because otherwise our scales are going to be a little intense. To see what it is I'm talking about, we'll go ahead and take a look at the terrain. Just go ahead and I'm going to render this out a little bit smaller for the moment. Now, what we're seeing is on the tops everything looks okay. We've got that geometry, or it looks like the geometry is being added because it does match the look of the actual geometry, the bump map, modifying that. The problem with a parametric is it is confined to the space of the object itself. Now, what this means is that our distribution on the x and the y is equal to the size of the terrain, which is correct. But the z-scale is only a slice, which means it's flat. And all of that information is still being relayed through the material, because it is a copy and paste and not a direct connection to the output with no z-vector. So everything is being squished, and it's basically the equivalent of taking the terrain. I'll just go ahead and copy and paste a version of it. It's pretty much the same as if we were to rotate it on its side and then scale it down and squish it to match that z height. So that's why we're seeing all of those lines within the render, and that's why this looks basically the same, because all of that information for the scale is transferred through, and it's just being squished. Now, if you crank up the render quality and texture anti-aliasing, you could probably pull something pretty nice out of that. But for the most part, it's just way too much information. So there are different ways we can deal with this and modify it in order to get to fit correctly. One way is to go to the z-scale in the bump and increase it to basically the ratio in which it was modified. But also keeping in mind that since we're working with a material, the coordinate space may be different. But we can start by increasing that z-scale to 100, which should stretch out the material and give us something that looks much better. Now, for the most part, I mean, that looks pretty good. But one problem is we're also stretching the material outside of the range of its original creation. So kind of picturing that terrain on its side again, and then if you stretch it outward, those details that were creating the different parts of the geometry are no longer in the same location that they were before, because we've scaled it so much. So although this technique can be useful for creating a nice variation with a pretty similar match to the current layout, and can give you some nice distributions, it is one way we can do it. But in order to get a perfect match, which is kind of what I want because I really want to extend the geometry, what we need to do is modify that vector. So first I will go back and change that z-scale to 1, even though it doesn't matter because it will become null once we make this change. We're going to go into the vector transformation that was originally created as a meta node. And if you don't have the meta node because you're using a version earlier than 7, if you're using 5 or 6, you'll just have this chain. What we want to do is go to the matrix transformation and set the z from 1 to 0, completely removing it, and creating a slice of that current vector to modify our materials. Now, we may also need to do that for this square. This is a pretty large one. It's going to match up really well. But to be sure, what I would like to do is add in a math node, vector operation, and matrix transformation, and connect that. Set it to 0. Another available node for this, you could also use the XYZ product would work. A new node that was added in version 8, I believe, is a projection onto a plane, which by default already has this setup, which is 0, 0, 1. It works a little bit differently the way the vectors are. If the vectors are set to 0, they're unmodified. If they're set to 1 or higher, they basically return the same output basically by removing it. Once other values are set above 0, then 1 has more of an influence. But that is another available option if you're using version 8 or higher. So with that change made, we can now render this and take a look. So now we have some rounder edges. Everything looks a little bit smoother. What I want to do at this point too is go into the material, and under effects, the contrast, I'm going to go ahead and turn that up to about 22%. What this is going to do is create a diffuse sharpness. And it'll help the fall off around the smoother areas. And that way we can rely a little more on the bump than the geometry in order to pull more elements out. Now another thing that I think works pretty well is to going back, and I'm just right clicking to open the function. What we can do is set a small amount of offset. This does need to be added after the matrix transformation in order to work, because the matrix transformation does remove any Z information. So I do have an offset, and right now that is being published because I have it connected to that on-off switch, which it is currently off. But I'm going to add another offset node, setting it 0, 0, all the way across, except on the Z, what I'm going to do is hit a negative, say 5, just a very small amount of offset. So it should keep things really close, but we'll start to add extra little details around the edges, just with a little tiny shift. And that way we can pull out even more of the look. And I may go ahead and modify the offset a little bit more. We could probably bring it down a slightly smaller amount without losing too much detail. We do need to do this within the material and not within the terrain. So going back to the offset, let's go ahead and do a negative 20. So it does look better. Now the more we offset it, the more we're shifting the surface. So of course, if we go too far, we are going to go outside of the range that's producing the geometry. But with small changes, you still are within that primary material space, or that function space that's generating geometry enough to add some nice highlights to edges, but also add new details that don't show up in the geometry. Just kind of a cool way to mix them together. Another thing we could do is if we wanted to reverse this, so instead of having an exact extrusion, we can reverse the depth and go to a negative. So let's go ahead and set this to negative 2. So we're reversing the function to subtract rather than add to it, and that can make it look even more impressive depending on the settings that you have. In most cases it looks pretty good. So we're seeing a little more detail now because we're setting it in more. Sometimes on the edges this can cause a problem because you're telling the geometry that is there that it's not there by subtracting it with the bump. So sometimes it won't be great. You really just got to test it and see. Another thing that is really nice is that because we have the entire material within, or the entire function within the material, we can separate all of these elements and even start to modify some of the values that were important for creating the geometry for the terrain, but not as important for a material. You can get away with a lot more when it comes to a material. With certain filters you can use the ranges. You don't need to worry about tearing geometry or anything like that. So with some of the contrast we used for that square filter, where we have this really high contrast in the way things are being cut out, we can reduce contrast amounts. And you may not see a preview. Of course, again, that is because of the way that square filter is set up. Unfortunately, we don't get to see how it is being clipped. But I'm going to go ahead and just reduce these contrast sizes That way, we'll start to get smoothing in some of the areas. And I'm just going to do this randomly. I'm not going to do it for every single one. And some of these changes aren't really going to modify anything because in this case, I don't have small features or mix turned on. So the small square section or group changes aren't being applied. But we can really modify this to create a pretty nice bump. We'll go ahead and take a look at that. So now we have a much smoother and rounder surface because we don't have some of those really high contrasts. We could also go into some of the mixing amounts. Say that last function that combines the two primary, the detail and the main shapes, and switching that from a minimum to, say, a multiply or one of the other nodes, it will add detail throughout. Let's go ahead and take a look at this with a depth of just 1. We can also use the absolute wave filter now without any problems showing that we would have with geometry. We just want to take a look at this from a little bit farther away. So from this range, it really starts to just have so much detail to it. Now, I didn't create any noises to create super fine detail on the surface. So that could be something I could add in, creating a noise with a even smaller scale for the wavelength or the overall scale of the noise. Or we could start to fake it with the materials, either on the bump or changing diffuse settings, or even start populating this with an ecosystem if needed. But for the most part, even just having just that bump channel has just brought out so much more out of this. But right now, the color is still just a bland color. There's no changes in highlights. So we're also going to connect this to control some other aspects of the material. So let's go ahead and edit the color map that's connected to color and modify that first color. I'm going to make this a little more desaturated and a little bit darker. We've kind of got something that's a little red. We'll make it a little yellower this time, somewhat towards green, but still more desaturated at the moment. Just something simple to start with. And now, if we want, we could connect the control for this color map, which uses grayscale, a numeric input, to control between the -1, which is the left side of the color map, to +1, which is the right side of the color map. And just connect that to our output for the buildings. So we start to see a little bit of a color change. And I'm going to go ahead and modify, maybe add a few more points, a few different colors. And we can create some sharper variations, some darker tones. And we'll start with that. So it's already starting to look better. Now, because I just made a direct connection to that altitude, or what was originally the altitude, it's really no different than connecting the color map to the altitude input node on the top of this function. So to actually make it worth having within the material, let's go ahead and add a filter. Selecting our connection before the color, add a filter node, and let's use and start with absolute wave. And this we can just kind of play around with to get something more interesting. If we modify it too much, it will take the colors outside of the range of the map in some cases. So one thing to pay attention to. We could use a variety of different filters and also mix filtered parts of this image together, or this function together with the blender. So setting up another filter, connecting, and then adding combiners and blenders and really varying it a lot more. A lot of different ways we could use this direct material to control the different aspects of the material. So it's still kind of the same as it was before. It is slightly different because we do have certain areas that are in higher elevation that have that darker tone to them. But a pretty decent variation overall for the initial color. We can of course modify this. And I do want to go to that color map where we have that really light area. And I think that's a little too yellow. I'm going to desaturate it and darken it to something that's a little browner, so that it was a little bit too bright. And then that last one, I'm going to lighten it up, make it more of a bluish tint. And that green, well, we'll make that more towards a red color. And that is starting to look a little bit better. I do want to make the surface change a little more by adding a highlight that is different. We can increase the highlight amount, and I'm going to make this material a little bit shinier and set up variable highlights. So turning on the variable highlight, editing the function, and we're going to get the highlight output. And we can connect this to anything within here, whether we want to use the final output or use some of the filtered areas, even the individual nodes, anything we want to do in order to get a nice variation that isn't an identical match to the existing setup. So what I'm going to do is go up to where that first combiner is that connects the two and connect the highlight to that section. So that combiner, select that link, add in a filter node, and I'm going to set it to the opposite. So we're going to reverse this and go in the other direction. And anytime we do that, we also need to offset, because what's going to happen is it's going to keep us or kick us out of the range that we want to be in, which is that -1 to 1, just the typical range to control just about anything in the function editor. We can also go through and add another filter after that. Say use the smooth threshold, set up a threshold amount or the threshold area. The transition is basically the gradient and the contrast of the transition. So how sharp the surface is going to be, and just kind of go through that. And you can also clip it low value, high value. I'm going to go ahead and type -0.25 for the threshold. Transition I'm going to set to 0.6, so we do want it a little bit sharper, and then just leave the other values. So now we have a variable highlight. Should look a little bit better. So it is a little more varied overall. It's still not extremely realistic at the moment because we don't really have any sort of detailed surface. There is another thing too, and that is the fact that because the altitude is controlling this, and we did remove that z vector, the really vertical areas, so basically almost all the walls or any vertical sections, really, even with the offset that we set up, won't have really anything on them. So we really don't have any sort of vertical textures. So what we need to do is add in an additional set of noises to control those wall sections and steeper slopes. So you can see some of the areas do have that offset really showing, but most of the areas don't. Most of the areas we don't really see anything on them. They're just kind of plain, kind of flat. So we do want to have some lines or maybe some blocks. Just use something to add to it, whether on the color or the bump, or both. Diffuse or the highlight. Just something to add the variation to those steeper surfaces. So I'm going to find another area that's got some larger steep walls. And we want to pick a noise that's going to work well for this. So we're going to go into the function editor for the material. And we're just going to mix this with the current bump for the moment. So I'm going to add in, now if we want to have more detail, we can start to bring in fractals. The fractals I wanted to avoid in the terrain because the geometry is just going to be way too chaotic. But within the material, we can get away with a lot more. So we can start to use fractals. So what I'm going to do is take the connection to the bump, add in a combiner node. We could just use the blender and set up our ratio. And I'm going to set up this fractal. We're going to go ahead and pick what we want to use. So we could use maybe, let's say, using the square pattern, square pairs. We'll start with that and just kind of see how it looks. I'm going to go ahead and take our largest feature amount and set that to, actually we'll use 4. Now also keeping in mind that this will also be squished on that Z to match the height of the terrain, so we probably are going to need to go a lot larger to prevent lines from showing, or just really fine lines. So let's set the Z scale to 50, or the Z wavelength. And then our blender, we can set our mode that we want to use. Let's go ahead and we'll stick with Blender for now, just to see how it's going to look and see how that turns out. So definitely a lot more detail, as you can see on the vertical sections, but also keep in mind this is adding to the details of the tops as well. It's not just working vertically, it's going to work throughout. So we have a couple of ways we could either cut that out based on a slope amount, or we can just kind of keep it as is in order to add that detail. Because we don't really have anything to define that sort of detail on the rest of the objects. So I will do one thing, which is to increase that scale, because I thought it was a little bit small. So take that largest feature, and I'm going to bump it up to 8. I'm also going to reduce that Z-scale to, say, 35, because I thought maybe that was stretched a little too much. And the gain, I'm going to set to 1.5. And the blending, let's use a 0.25. So just a small blend, nothing major for now. We could also go ahead and multiply it or use a different blending mode, also use a combiner, multiple combiners, add different fractals. Obviously, what we can do with it is endless. But just to get it to a good sturdy point, well, there's not too much detail. Just using this basic setup works pretty well. We could also add this to our color function, the finer details, that part of the fractal. in order to also create some changes there. But I do want to pull out the depth a little bit. And I'm going to use the bump. And because I'm going to be modifying this, I'm going to bring it up to a depth of 4. That's going to make the fractal probably way too intense. So we can go to that blender and set that to, say, 0.1. Or we can add it instead of blending. So add to the existing bump that we already have. So then we're just kind of overlaying this other one on top. And if you need to reduce the fractal, if you're getting too many artifacts, you can easily do that. So I also want some more detailed areas in the color, because the color is really bland right now. So I'm just going to zoom out so we can see a little bit more what's going on. And go to our color map and add in another color map. We're going to edit it, and I'm going to make adjustments and just kind of modify, maybe making it a little bit more desaturated, and removing some of these colors, shifting them around. It doesn't have to be a huge change. And what I want to do is connect this to what we're using to create the bump. And then what we can do is use a color blender or a color combiner. So under the combiner node, selecting color combiner, adding both of those to it, and we can add a lot of different color combinations and then set our mode, which there are a lot of different ways we can modify color and choose a combination mode that is just has this huge list. So I'm going to choose the slope bend to begin with and see how that turns out. That should provide a pretty good amount of change. It looks like maybe the color map wasn't shifted enough. So for the most part, I mean, we do have some great variations showing in different areas, but I am going to modify that color a little bit more, because these light areas, I think, maybe a little too much. And we can just shift this around, and we can also see a preview of how that's turning out. I'll go ahead and render this up a little bit larger. And we can take a look. So looking better. Now because we're using a slope bend, what's happening is we have a transition between these colors based on the slope. So it's switching kind of between the color maps and their inputs based on where the slope levels are. And it does create a really nice color change and good shading. But we still don't have the details on the flatter surfaces being modified. So we can and just add more to it if needed. We can start setting up, if you have version 6 or higher, adding layers on top of the material with some different alphas. We can also start mixing in texture maps. A lot of things we can do with it. One thing I think is that that fractal is still just showing up way more than I'd like it to. So I'm going to set this to 0.02 and increase the scale to 16 for the largest feature. We can also take the roughness, maybe 0.45, bring it down just a little. Let's go ahead and take a look, maybe at a different area with different sets of geometry. So definitely getting better. It does look a little plasticky for the most part. So we can continue modifying shaders in different ways to pull out different areas. But I do want to show some of the other methods for modifying this before we move on any further. So I am going to go back and improve the color a little bit by multiplying our controls for the color with either the same fractal we're using with the bump, or creating a new one. I want some of the features to match and have different color variations based on that fractal. So I'm going to add a blender to the connection to that first color map, connect this to that fractal to the altitude, and we are going to set it to subtract. Maybe we'll go ahead and multiply instead. We don't want to lose too much of the look. I'm also going to go ahead and I might need to clip the map intensity because it is coming in pretty harsh. So let's go ahead and do 0.5, maybe 0.1. We'll start with 0.1. And I'm also going to add an absolute wave filter to that. We're really not seeing a preview because of the size difference between the original position and the way we have the vectors modified for the rest of the material. So I'm just going to kind of pay attention to the color preview in order to see any changes that may or may not be showing up. And it looks like that didn't really help the surface enough. The biggest problem is that we just don't have enough color points within the color map. There's just not enough change in order to be able to pick up from that. So instead of adding that and intensifying this more, I'm going to just add in some new color points that are going to create a shift. And if you remember where some of the areas are that look like they need the biggest change, you can go to that specific color and make sure you modify around that area. Just different shifts overall to give a variation. And I'm just double clicking, which is creating a key point and automatically opening up the color shifter. Go back to that green. I think that's a little too bright. Desaturate it. And we can do that for the other modifier too. We can also load in color maps. Right now I just want to modify these manually. We'll see how that looks. And if we have to, we can switch over to a different combination mode. If this sets up too dark, we can also go to the Effects tab and increase the diffusion amount. Let's go ahead and set it to 75 just to lighten it up, just in case it ends up too dark. And that did start to help, but I really do think that slope bend just needs to go for the moment. I can create another map to take care of the slope. I do like the transition, but some of these details just aren't showing the way I want them. So let's go ahead and multiply these two together. And see how that's going to turn out. So some areas are showing up better, some aren't. I don't want to spend all my time just messing around with this color function, losing some of the stuff I like, and having to add to it. So what's going to be a better solution for what I'm hoping to achieve here, and I am going to go back and set this to a slope bend because there's not really a huge point in changing that since I liked it before. And modify the contrast. We might need to lighten it up before the output, which we can do with a color correction node. But I think what's going to end up being easier is modifying the diffusion, which is the lightness. So we're going to add an output node of diffuse. And before we connect anything to this diffusion, I want to set up a map. So we're going to add a filter, set it to map. And what we need to do is adjust this to make sure that we're not going to get the surface to be too dark or too light. Now, by default, the value is around 0.2 to 0.4. So basically, you're converting a percentage to the -1 to 1 value, -1 being 0% and 1 being 100%. Now, some values are reversed, like the contrast. That is a reversed output where 0% is equal to 1. So sometimes you need to reverse it, but for the most part, it should match up pretty well. So what I'm going to do is set my lower value to -0.3, my high value to 0.6, which is actually going to be kind of bright, but since we have a darker surface, that should be okay. Connector diffuse to the map, and that will give us a medium color at the moment because we don't have anything connected to this. And we're going to use a connection to either something within the node itself, or we can go back, and I want to show you now one of the other options we have for controlling this material. I'll go ahead and click OK, open up the terrain editor, edit the function. Now this is for version 7 users and up, so if you have version 6 or 5, you will need to stick within that material function regardless. But if you do have 7 or up, what you can do is within this terrain function you can add a new output node custom dependency, which is going to output this function directly into the material editor with correct sizing and also take into account that -z. So I'm going to name this just primary. We could also go in and select individual things, individual noises we want to output separately. The only disadvantage to this is that we don't have that ability to go in and modify the contrast just on the material without it being within the material function, because it will modify the geometry. But we'll go ahead and connect that. So we have this primary output. We can go back into our material, and I'm going to go ahead and save a new version. And I always save incremental when using View. Very important, because you never know what's going to happen. So we'll go through into the material, and what we can do is add in input node external dependency. If we select our terrain from the list, we have that custom output available. Now I always kind of add brackets before it, and sometimes put a letter in the bracket to signify and really separate them from the internal dependencies that are available, just to know that they're mine. Makes it a little easier to pick out. So now we're adjusting the contrast or the diffusion with this. I'm going to add a filter. We've got smooth threshold. We'll stick with those default values. Added another filter. Change it over to the opposite. And we'll probably end up adding more variation to that in the end. This should already start to modify things a little bit better. Might need to add a parabolic filter in order to pull out finer details, because even right now, although I can start to see certain areas showing, it's not modifying everything the way I'd like it to. So still needs a little bit of work, just because we have such flat areas in some of those zones. So I also want to start to mix this with the fractal. We're going to take the diffusion, and we need to make sure that map is still going to be last no matter what. Add in a new blender, and connect this to that simple fractal, to the altitude. And we are going to multiply. Multiply by 0.5. That's yeah, we'll go ahead and set it 0.4 or 0.3, maybe 0.35. Don't need to clip the out of range values. If I want to go a little higher, I can set this maybe to 0.7 with a high value, negative 0.5, make it a little bit darker. We might need to set up an offset, or what we can do is add in a new filter before that, or just after the opposite. And what I want to do for this is set it to the parabolic, and just make a few changes to try to pull out more variation detail. I'm also going to go back to that map and clip the outer range values. I don't want it to go below those settings. That's basically the point of it. Keep in mind too, if your multiply values go too low, you'll start to divide rather than multiply. Also, the parabolic can change the final output too drastically sometimes. Let's go back and start over. So let's just do 5 on the B, 0.5 on the B, and negative 0.5 on the C. And then go back, add another blender just before that map. Connect it to the original input, the external dependency. Set it to a maximum or a minimum. We'll go ahead and use max. And then we'll go ahead and see how that's going to look as our modifier. So we definitely have some higher contrast areas showing now. For the most part, it hasn't changed as much as I'd like it to. And some of that banding on the edges from all those additional points I added before, I might go in and clean it up a bit. I think at this point I would rather use additional material layers rather than sticking this same material layer, because it's getting, I think, a little out of hand here. There's just too much going on, and we also don't want to impact the render too much. That should be pretty good for the most part. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a little, and then there'll be a version of that available, a save file. We're going to continue and take a look at some more materialing options.